And we're on the air. I want to welcome everybody into the Fifth Dimension podcast. I'm here with Jeff Tkach from the Rodale Institute, where he is the Chief Impact Officer there. Jeff, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey, thank you so much, Evan, for having me. It's a real honor to be here today.
Yeah, it's truly my pleasure, and I'm excited to learn from you and really dive deep into the topic of what you guys are doing at the Rodale Institute. So I've read for you yourself personally, you're sort of on a mission to, reconnect humans with the earth, and you want to, re-emphasize that for people. And I very much, relate with that, sort of wanting to strive for that connection. I mean, can you talk about sort of the work you guys are doing at Rodale Institute, and, maybe for anybody who uh, isn't familiar, what sort of is regenerative agriculture and sort of the practice of it?
Yeah, sure. So Rodale Institute is a global nonprofit that happens to be based in Eastern Pennsylvania. And for over 70 years, we've been putting hard science to this idea of organic agriculture or regenerative agriculture. So Rodale Institute, in many ways, is credited for pioneering the whole organic farming movement in North America. Our founder, J.I. Rodale, he's actually the guy that literally coined the term organic as we use it today. So he was a real pioneer in and of himself, and then our organization, continues to pave the way. We're primarily a research and a education organization. So um, the misnomer is that there's all kinds of universities out there doing organic farming research, but unfortunately that's not the case. Most of our land grant universities are funded by big agricultural interests, and the research that is being done in the university settings is primarily to perpetuate chemical conventional farming. So in many ways, Rodale Institute is pretty much the only independent, privately held research organization of its kind in the world that's literally doing science that would empower farmers to move away from chemical dependent agriculture towards these regenerative practices.
And that's beautiful that you guys are doing that research. And I didn't actually realize that sort of there's that vested interest with the universities, and so that large scale agricultural movement. It's almost they sort of have their hands in the organic movement, and this sort of research, I would imagine. What I think most people sort of know organic is healthy. Like people have like they see organic, they're like, all right, this is healthy for me. Uh, what is the true impact of organic farming? Like why is it important that you guys are having you are this independent research, doing this research outside of sort of this vested interest of the large scale agricultural movement? Where have they sort of strayed in terms of the health for the individual, and why is it important that we work towards almost sort of optimizing the health of food over necessarily like the profits and the sort of vested interests that you mentioned?
Yeah, well, you have to really look at the science that's coming out of the United Nations. When you look at a recent study that was conducted, I think it was funded by the United Nations, that suggests that if we continue to farm the way that we farm around the world using chemical conventional approaches to agriculture, we have approximately 60 arable growing seasons left on planet Earth. So we've lost our connection to the soil. We as consumers, primarily here I'll blame the United States, primarily here in the United States,
Hmm.
but of course all around the world, we as consumers have demanded cheap food, and that's what our farmers produce for us. Um, we have so commoditized agriculture that the way in which we are now our farmers are being forced to produce commodity crops using heavy chemically intensive methods that are stripping our soils of vital nutrients. When you take a teaspoon and you dip it, if you were to take a teaspoon and dip it into uh, an area of healthy soil and then put that soil under a microscope, you would find over 10 billion microorganisms in one teaspoon of soil,
Wow.
which is insane. So in some ways, soil is the most complex ecosystem on the planet. It's teeming with life, and that life is what sustains you and me.
Hmm.
We've so decimated our soils of life that we are dying as a society because of the way in which we produce food. Our food that we are producing is making us sick. Yeah, somewhere around 1975, we saw this dramatic inflection point in chronic illness. All of a sudden, in 1975, around the year 1975, we began to see dramatic upticks in chronic illnesses, obesity, diabetes, cancers, autism, autoimmune conditions. And
Mhm.
so that begs the question, well, what happened in 1975, right?
Right.
And the answer is that that's the year that we patented Roundup, which is a glyphosate, which is a ubiquitous chemical that's being used in agriculture. And we're using it at the tune of 4.5 billion pounds annually on our cropping lands. And so we've basically have been at a chemical warfare with our farming systems, with our soils. And
Mhm.
what we at Rodale Institute are suggesting is that we reintroduce biological approaches to farming instead of chemical approaches. So at the heart of who we are as an organization is we are trying to reconnect humans with the earth and the soil, and
Mhm.
ultimately show farmers how they can farm with nature and not against it.
Right. And I love that mission, and that is so important. And you sort of talked about the consumer economy we live in. Everything we demand cheap, and food is
Mm.
sort of the perfect example of that. I mean, we shop online all the time. We almost sort of externalize our whole way of living. We live in a
Mhm.
commodification culture. So,
Yeah.
and with our approach to food, and we have these sort of mass crop agricultural systems where it is essentially cash cropping. How it's inevitable that we need to sort of make the switch. You said we have 60 years of this system at most left. So how do we begin to actually make that switch, because this food that we mass produce does feed a lot of people. It does sort of it serves a purpose in a way to feed people cheaply. How do we begin to make that switch at a more societal level? And does that ultimately start with the individual? Is that something the individual has to invest in themselves?
Yeah, you're very astute, and because I would have guessed that you were going to take this in a political direction,
Mhm.
because certainly there's policies in our federal government here in the United States that are perpetuating this system. The system and this collapse that we're facing are perpetuated certainly by political barriers.
Mhm.
However, I believe, and our contention is that you and I as consumers can be the change. We vote 3 times a day by what we put on our plate. And so
Mm.
it really starts with awareness. We need to begin to educate and inform consumers around where their food comes from and how it was produced. And we need to reintroduce humans with agriculture. So we have become so divorced as a society around agriculture. Walk up to anyone on the street and ask them if they've ever visited. Most people, if you ask them, have you ever visited a farm? Have you ever actually visited a farm where your own food comes from? I think the answer would likely be no.
Right.
And so we need to change that. We need to reconnect humans with agriculture. We need to begin to get consumers to understand that what they choose to put on their plate can actually change the future of humanity as we know it. Because if we begin to create demand, you and I create demand every time we go to the grocery store. If we
Right.
begin to change the demand for food based on how those farmers are treating the soil. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is that most of the food you and I purchase at the grocery store is produced in a very chemically intensive way. Most of the food that we purchase is net imported from other countries,
Mm.
which with all due respect, I'm sure many other countries are farming in an amazing way, but we shouldn't have to be net importing food in the United States of America, where most of our land is cropland.
Right.
And so ultimately, we as consumers can demand food based on how it was produced, and that can single-handedly change the course of history.
Right, definitely. So there's almost this need, if you will, to sort of decentralize how we control our food and bring it back to a more local level, and sort of more of an interaction with the community. And with
It's about right relationship. It's
right,
about
so
relationship.
right, definitely. And we have these large scale imports, and we have these massive cash, crop systems. How do we, like, with individuals creating demand for organic, is that something that is actually obtainable for most people? Because there is, I think, the conception that organic is more expensive, and there is sort of the idea that people, I don't necessarily know if this is factually the case, but people view the unhealthy food as cheaper, and there's a lot of people who struggle to buy groceries, and that sort of struggle to meet sort of the baseline needs, if you will. So how realistic is it for most people to put an emphasis on this, switch to organic and really interaction with their local food base?
Um, there are, in just about any community that you can identify in the United States, there is at least some farming community on the outside of town that is doing the right thing. And these
Mhm.
farmers that are, these small scale farmers that are not even small scale, I shouldn't just limit it to that. There are small scale and large scale producers that are beginning to adopt these regenerative practices that we espouse at Rodale. The problem is that these farmers need markets. They need demand. We as consumers have begun to get comfortable with convenience. And so we expect to walk into any grocery store in January and find fresh tomatoes
Right.
instead of becoming more in tune with seasonality of food. And it's because we're not supporting the very farmers in our own backyards. Prior to COVID-19, I travel a lot with my job, and I'm very particular about what I eat. And I travel to very diverse places with this work. I often travel to very rural, remote areas of the United States and other countries, and as well as urban major metropolitan areas. And one of my favorite things to do is study farms right in those communities. And I've never traveled to a place where I couldn't find an amazing local food source, within a 30-minute drive of my destination. So I think we have to get out of our comfort zones as consumers. And yeah, I think it's very possible that we can reinvent supply chains, and and I think COVID-19, actually, it's funny, you didn't ask this of me, but I need to, I feel the urgency to say that this pandemic has literally exposed some tremendous vulnerabilities in our supply chains.
Hmm.
And the reason that there was this food shortage and sort of crisis that happened this spring during COVID-19 was because we've so commoditized and centralized the supply chain of where our food comes from through these big mass produced factory farms that it's forced us to look to local supply chains.
Right.
Frankly, there was a surgence of organic food consumption this spring. Organic food sales were up 18%, according to the Organic Trade Association. It's one of the largest single month increases in the history of organic.
Wow.
And local farms that are doing direct to consumer sales, I actually have heard statistics where some farms are up 400% year over year in terms of
Wow.
sales. Yeah, so we saw how a pandemic could literally shift consumer behavior overnight. So I do believe it's possible. The problem is that we have a short memory, and
Hmm.
that it's not long until we go back to our comfortable ways of going into the
Right.
grocery store and expecting that there it is. There's the tomato in January.
Right, definitely. There's like a great level of sacrifice that almost needs to be made at the individual level to, uh, you know, get get to know your sort of local, what is grown in what season. I can't. I'm in New England. I can't necessarily buy strawberries in January per se if I'm going to shop locally, because that's
Yeah,
not
yeah, yeah.
something that's.
So sacrifice is an interesting word of choice. I know I completely agree with you, and I understand exactly what you're saying. I would challenge us all to reframe the word from
Hmm.
um, uncomfortable to it's actually joy. There's joy in that when you begin to live more in tune
Hmm.
with seasonality, with local, with source. Like the closer you get to source, that's where the joy is. And my wife and I are really into this. Like we love to cook. We'd love to visit farms on the weekends. We're blessed here in Pennsylvania with awesome local farms. I love having conversations with farmers, and we also started an amazing garden in our backyard, not too far from where I'm sitting right now. And there's a joy like that come and a simplicity that comes with connecting with food and seasonality and source and soil. And at first it's definitely it can be uncomfortable. It costs more. And so therefore you have to make sacrifices in other parts of your life.
Right.
At least we do. We live on a budget, and we've just made some sacrifices in other parts of our life to find joy here. And I kind of like it.
Right, definitely. And I sort of love that mindset you have towards it in terms of it's almost like it brings a level of empowerment to it instead of viewing it as a, oh, I can't have my strawberries in January. Instead of you sort of take the mindset of I'm going to connect and really, you know, almost be one with my local community and my local farmers. And I think that could bring a great level of empowerment and sort of drive people to, you know, really embrace these practices. Because I think, you know, I look at sort of the large scale agriculture movement and what's going on and all the vested interests. We're not necessarily going to see a push for organic through the mainstream media or sort of through, you know, where the corporations have vested interests, whether it be, you know, on the news or just wherever I guess where most people sort of get their information. You aren't necessarily going to see that um,
Right.
push for organic. So how do people sort of begin to when I guess when you're sort of not exposed in it or you're not sort of looking outside of the box for these um, practices, is there a way to sort of connect with people um, to you know about the source and sort of about their food, and what ways can like people begin to engage in dialogue with others about this? Like how do we sort of make it more mainstream to be uh, you know going in this direction?
Well, I think no change happens in isolation. I think change only happens in community.
Mm,
So we need to come together um, to form that change, to build coalitions that would happen in our own neighborhoods and our own backyards, that would begin to educate and empower one another and equip them with knowledge. I think I have a real heart right now, especially in light of all that we're facing societally with our urban populations and
mm,
with the minority populations. I think that's where the change needs to happen first. In some ways, the injustices around food create the larger, more systemic societal issues that we're facing. You know, our urban populations and our minority populations often have the least access to fresh, healthy, organic, local, nourishing food.
right.
They have, they have the least access. They're forced into these food deserts, and so I dream of a world where our most vulnerable populations have access to the healthiest and most nourishing food. Because if you change the food is medicine. If we change the way we eat, if we change what we put on people's plates, it changes everything. It changes your consciousness, it changes your heart, it changes your mind, it changes your attitude towards one another. And so at Rodale Institute, we build models. Okay, so we're a nonprofit that's trying to change the world, and
Mm,
you know we're 61 employees trying to change the world, and that's pretty hard. But we create models, and one model we've created is a program called Agriculture Supporting Communities. You can read about this on our website, rodaleinstitute.org. And this is a model whereby we now train farmers, young people that come to us, many of whom are young women, which is really cool, highly educated. They come to us because they want to be organic farmers, and they
mm,
spend an entire growing season with us. They learn the art of farming, they learn the craft, and in so doing, they produce amazing food. And we don't really have a market for that food. So what we've done is we truck all that food on a refrigerated vehicle into inner city Allentown, Pennsylvania, which is a low income, low access inner city about 10 miles from our campus. And every Thursday from spring through fall, low income, low access families come and can purchase that food using double SNAP points, using their food stamps.
mm.
So for $15 a week or $30 a week, we can feed an entire family with fresh, organic, local food, nourishing food, food that heals. And so that's what we need, is we need that model to be replicated again and again and again in every city across this country and around
Right.
the world.
Definitely. And that's really empowering. And you mentioned just the price for 15 to $30 per week, you can feed a family. That's cheaper than your average trip to the grocery store.
And that's the thing, Evan, is like, that's the thing is we've so externalized the price of food. Like it's like organic food is not for the elite. It doesn't have to be. It's just that we have policies and we've built supply chains that make it more expensive, but it doesn't have to be. If we begin to break down barriers for farmers in our own backyards to produce this food, instead we're net importing, we're relying on grocery stores to purchase this food. So we just need to remove those barriers.
Right, definitely. And I think that's so important. And, when I was living in Boston, I actually made it a point to, when I could, to go down to the farmer's market they had it Saturday mornings. It was in the middle of like downtown. And, I would notice the difference in, the fruits and veggies I would buy there. They were a lot fresher and
Mhm.
than what I would buy at the grocery store. And I loved sort of connecting with the local farmers. And it was really wonderful to sort of have that within an urban environment. Because I think you're right. When you have millions of people living in an urban sprawl, say like New York City, where you have all these different, diverse communities of people, it can be very difficult to uh, even know where a local food source might be. So sort of making it a priority to, give access to that group of people, I think is sort of that first step. Because you're right, it is sort of medicine when we sort of can reconnect with food on a greater level. We're reconnecting with earth, we're reconnecting with sort of the source of ourselves in a way, because
Yeah.
we're in tune with nature, like just as human beings, we're the species on the planet. So
Yeah, totally. I mean, when I say medicine, I don't just mean like for the physical body. I think it's medicine for healing all of the ailments of our society right now. Like
mm,
on a spiritual level, like I think food is the foundation to healing.
right. And I would definitely agree with that. And that's sort of I think we need to start working towards systems in our society that sort of are more that emulate nature in a more uh, fundamental way. I think with sort of our externalized approach to how we organize ourselves as human beings, and consumerism and commodification and sort of the culture that we've built is very uh, externalized, and the earth is sort of viewed as a finite resource, if you will, as opposed to something that is sacred and something that is something
Totally,
something we're a part of.
totally.
So and so with that in mind, do you think food is that first step to how we sort of build something more sustainable? And is this something that can sort of go hand in hand when we look at sort of the push for, we talk about climate change and we talk about sort of the environmental movement as well. Does sort of agriculture, would you say that is just as important, and like they go hand in hand with those type of movements? Because when we think about climate change, I don't necessarily hear the narrative often of uh, more organic agriculture and regenerative
Yeah.
agriculture.
2013, Rodale Institute published a white paper, which we're in the process of updating, and we will re-release during Climate Week in September this year. But we authored a white paper on regenerative agriculture and climate change.
Mhm.
And our findings over 40 years of data have informed our findings that suggest that if we were to change the way in which we manage our farmland here in the United States, just in the United States, and we began to transition those croplands away from chemical high tillage management practices, chemically induced management practices, to these regenerative organic approaches. If we just transition the land here in the United States and did nothing else, no other measure of wind, solar, renewables, etc.,
Mhm.
we could sequester all of the world's carbon emissions in our US farming soils.
Wow.
So the potential in our croplands just in this country, if we were to change the management practices of those lands to these regenerative organic practices, we would solve for climate change.
Wow.
So essentially, what to me, if I were to put that into everyday language, we can literally eat our way out of climate change.
That is an enticing option right there. I mean,
Yeah,
people
right,
love
right.
people love to eat, and so, and I think that's so important, because that's not a narrative that necessarily comes out. We talk about wanting to save the earth and,
Mhm.
reduce our carbon footprint. And I don't think people necessarily, we all want to move in that direction and sort of make a more sustainable planet. But I think a lot of people don't necessarily just know
Mhm.
what exact steps to take. Like there isn't a
Mhm.
step-by-step guideline per se that says do X, Y, and Z. And if each individual does this, then we will
Mhm.
sort of save the earth. Then we will sort of, be able to create this, the world we're kind of talking about.
That
That
we all want
is
to live in. Yeah, right.
right, exactly. And it's interesting because I think there's a lot of people who don't necessarily. Uh, we hear of like climate change deniers, and we hear of sort of the people are very skeptical of organic, or don't
Mhm.
see the importance of
Mhm.
it. How do you sort of um, relay this message to people who might be skeptical of organic or don't necessarily um, want to look at that hard data of, climate change is real, and we do need to sort of change uh, what we're doing as a society. Is there a way to sort of personalize that for people and, get them to uh, at the very least sort of see the organic side of it and move in that direction?
Um, I think the best way to make that change is through firsthand experience, and just to simply, I would invite and encourage people. It's now we're conducting this interview in the middle of June.
Hmm.
um, I think I would challenge your audience and everyone listening to try it on for themselves. Number one, like look up, like a quick Google search is going to land you on either a local farmers market or a farm itself. I want you to drive there this weekend. Take some time, carve out some time, and reconnect with a farmer or a farmer's market. Have a conversation with that farmer. Ask that farmer about what inspires and motivates them to do what they do. Because frankly, and sadly, most of our farmers, it's not often the most valued profession, and so a lot of these people are doing it for not for monetary reasons, but they're doing it because of passion. And so I
Hmm.
want your audience to connect with a farmer, have a conversation, then purchase something from them. Just one thing. Maybe it's this time of year, you might get a really amazing head of lettuce, or some kind of green. And there's some, depending on where you live, there's other produce coming into season. So purchase that, and then the next day go to the grocery store and buy that same item, and have a taste test. Taste the difference.
Hmm.
Literally taste the difference. And I want you to really like just pause and reflect and get super quiet for a moment and consider the two different experiences of driving to a mass market to purchase a commodity crop, or the experience of visiting a farm and having a conversation and getting to know someone who's producing the food that's going to nourish and sustain your life. And so that's what I would offer.
And I think that's beautiful, and that's sort of that is a direct way to sort of see the difference and feel the difference. And with this, you know, taking the organic approach, and you do this in your personal life. What have you noticed? I don't know how long this journey has been for you, but sort of uh, having this approach in your daily life, have you noticed, the change that you've found on an individual level? How is that sort of, what has that brought out for you? And what does that, you know, I guess you could say mean to you on that, personal level? And how is it sort of related to everything else in your life to sort of take this organic approach and really feel the difference?
Well, I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for that approach. I mean, I had my own sort of health collapse uh, that ultimately led me to do the work I'm doing today. That happened around 4 years ago, three and a half, four
Hmm.
years ago, where I fell chronically sick, with no diagnosis, no explanation, despite 5 or 6 doctors in and out of their offices, thousands and thousands of dollars of tests,
Hmm.
only for them to find no conclusive results as to why I had a medical health collapse. Ultimately, found my way to a doctor who was able to do some detective work. He practices what's called functional medicine, which is an approach to medicine that's not dissimilar to organic agriculture. It's more of like a systems based approach to medicine.
Hmm.
And ultimately, his diagnosis was that I had chronic Lyme disease. and there was no medicine, there was no silver bullet that was going to get me better. And I asked him, I said, "Doctor, how am I going to heal?" And he said, "It's we're going to do this. We're going to do this systematically, and it's going to start with food, and we're going to change your diet, we're going to change your lifestyle." And little by little, over time, I healed. And
Mhm.
so I've borne witness to the power of food as medicine, and I believe in it to the core of my being, and I want to share that with everyone that I can. That's what drives me to do this work.
Right. That's beautiful. And that's sort of, the perfect example of you are what you eat. And, Lyme disease is something that I had another guest on the show who had Lyme disease, and he talked about sort of that same
Mhm.
it was almost a spiritual challenge in a way to take control of, the foods he put into his body and his, having a healthy lifestyle. And so you've sort of taken that same approach. And ever since I myself have paid more attention to the foods I'm eating and being conscious with organics and being conscious about what I choose to buy. Like when I was in, I think we can all relate to growing up wanting to go to the store and buying a bag of Doritos or candy and just sugar, and that's something we're innately taught it in,
Mhm.
as kids, that it's okay to sort of consume this food. And but once you sort of make that switch, you feel better in all aspects of your life. Like once I started eating better, my mental health got better. Once I started eating better, I got, better results from working out, and like I sort of my fitness improved, and it was just sort of it's
Well, that's
all
just the great
encompassing.
mystery. That's the great mystery, that everything is connected. And I do believe. And by the way, I can tell you that my Lyme disease had systemic issues that did impact my brain and my mental health.
Mm,
And there was no medicine that was going to heal that. It was my lifestyle. It was my food choices. It was my lifestyle choices. It was my daily meditation practice. It was all these things. It was working with my biology and not fighting against it, not trying to address a symptom, but reimagining the entire system that is my body and my mind that healed me.
right, definitely. And I think that exact sort of mindset where you don't just address the symptom, but you sort
Mm.
of reimagine the whole system is what we sort of need to strive towards on a societal
Yeah,
level. And I think that
yeah,
does start with the individual, because
yeah.
society is just a microcosm of the average individual, if you will, and sort of
Mhm,
it paints the picture of what how individuals live, because we sort
mhm.
of perpetuate the systems. We create the systems because we use them. Like if
Right,
everybody bought organic, we wouldn't have these huge cash crop farms anymore. Like it would just they wouldn't be needed. There would be no
right,
demands. Um,
right.
so I know we're
Yeah,
uh,
I've got just about 3 more minutes here.
awesome. So to sort of wrap up, is there any sort of steps you would give to the listeners to find resources about particular healthy foods or particular ways to shop organic and find out about, whether it be online resources or, like you said, going and visiting your local farmers? What sort of should be the next step for anybody who's listening?
Yeah. Okay, cool. I just dropped a link into the chat, and I'm assuming you can maybe share this in the show notes. But
Hmm.
I'm going to direct your listeners to rodaleinstitute.org/resources. You can actually get to it right from the homepage, and on that page, you're going to find three incredible resources. The first is a first of its kind white paper that we just released last month called "The Power of the Plate." It's the first scientific white paper that brings together doctors and farmers. So it was authored by doctors and farmers, and it's really providing our providing consumers with an idea and understanding of the science that would demonstrate the power of the plate to transform human health and agriculture. So highly encourage you to check that out. Secondly, you'll find another resource just below that called The Truth About Organic, and that is kind of an in-depth look for consumers, helping them to understand the nuances and the fundamentals of our food and farming systems, and help your audience to make more informed food choices. So that's where I would direct you and your audience to for more information.
All right, awesome. And I'll definitely put that in the episode description below so people can just scroll down. It'll be
Mhm.
right there. Awesome. Well, Jeff, thanks again for coming on the podcast. I've learned a lot myself, and
Cool.
so I really appreciate you coming on. It was a great time to
Yeah, it's
chat
been
with
my
you.
pleasure, Evan. And yeah, thanks for the great work in the world and what you're doing. And we need more people like you doing what you're doing, because this is a collective. It's a collective effort.
I greatly appreciate that, and I agree. And hopefully, a chat like this, it'll spread that awareness, and ultimately,
Yeah,
we can sooner rather than later see organic be the mainstream for
yeah,
agriculture.
yeah, exactly. Awesome, man. Well, you take care. Have a great rest of your day. It's been a pleasure.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you. You as well.
All right. Bye for
Bye.
now.
Bye.